poem we've taken up for study today is the voice of a modern poet. Starting from 1907, that's when he was born, right up to his death, well past the first half of the century, that is in 1973. A life that touched many lives, an intellectual with a commoner's touch, that was W.H.Auden for you. Born in 1907 in York, England, his family moved to Birmingham, an industrial part of the country. So you can see that his early influence was amidst an urban industrial setting. He moved on to Christ Church, Oxford, that's where he had his further education, and formed friendships that were lasting with Christopher Isherwood and Stephen Spender. W.H.Auden's father was a well-known physician with the interest and vast knowledge of mythology and folklore. His mother, a strict Anglican, also had a lasting influence on the boy's thoughts. His interest was basically science and engineering, and he got a scholarship to Christ Church, Oxford, where he went to pursue engineering, but discovered his love for poetry and changed his field of study to poetry. Now he had a group of friends, and of whom he was a key figure, and he was the head of this group called the Auden generation, or the Oxford group. Now they consisted of Louis MacNeice, Stephen Spender, and Cecil Day Lewis. A little about his contact with T.S. Eliot made Auden familiar with modern poetry. But of course, Auden evolved his own voice and his own style of speaking. His first volume of poems came out in 1928, and it was printed by Stephen Spender. 1930, yet another volume emerged, also modestly titled Poems. It was this that brought him to the attention of the reading public, and W.H.Auden arrived on the poetry scene. And it was then that his voice was heard and people recognized him as the voice of the century. Well, how did it all happen? Well, I think a large part of it is an innate gift. His finesse in writing was admired. Call it his craftsman-like skill or an inborn ability, but this finesse was part of his vocabulary and his style. Apart from it, his vast knowledge on all subjects, be it political, social, forms of literature, art, music, his repertoire of knowledge was vast, and he brought all of it into his works. Now, poetry's got to touch every man. Poetry does not live in an ivory tower. Well, that's the dream of every poet, to be read. W.H.Auden, with his diverse sensibility, a scientific mind with a literary bent, or a literary mind with a scientific bent, whichever way we put it, was what helped him, make himself to be heard in a scientific, rational age. That's W.H.Auden. Now, Auden moved on to the United States of America before the Second World War. He met Charles Calman, who was a major influence in his life. He won the Pulitzer Award in 1948 for his work titled The Age of Anxiety. That's what he spoke about, the 1930s as the Age of Anxiety. If you remember, it was also the age of the Great Depression in America. And since his work touched very vital political and moral issues. It struck a chord with the American people. So you can now call him the voice of America. Okay, it was Auden's innate sympathy for people that wherever the time or the place helped him reach out and made his voice to be heard. W.H.Auden also underwent certain changes in the influences that governed his thought and writing. He started off as being a Marxist and an anti-fascist. Now, these doctrines were a major influence in his writing. But when he moved on to America, there was a change in his thought and his thinking process, and he was convinced of Christian theology, and he went on to reading modern Protestant theologians, and he moved over to a firmer Christian belief. So from a Freudian psychoanalysis and socialistic approach, his shift was towards Christian theology. He was the Chancellor of the American Academy of Poetry from 1954 to 1973. And he shifted residence between Vienna, Austria, and New York City. And it was in 1973 that W.H.Auden passed away. The century lost a major influence, a voice that spoke for the people. The title Shield of Achilles points out to Greek literature. Now, the Shield of Achilles is a very, very small episode taken from the great poet Homer's epic, Iliad. Achilles was the son of Thetis, a sea nymph, and a mortal man. The son born to them was Achilles. Now, Achilles was born mortal, much to the regret of his mother Thetis. She wanted him to possess immortality. The story goes that she held him by the heel and dipped him into the river Styx. But I believe the heel stayed dry, so Achilles still retained a part of his mortal nature. Well, the story goes on to talk a little more about his destiny and so on, but the part that concerns us here is his shield. How does the shield come into the picture? Achilles' shield was a protection that his mother wanted him to have during the famous Trojan War. I'm sure we all heard of it at some point of study or the other. It was a war between the Trojans and the Greeks, and the famous Helen of Troy was the face that launched 1,000 ships. Yes, the face also that caused a lot of loss of lives. So this beautiful woman is behind the Trojan War. Well, Achilles was fighting under the leadership of Agamemnon, and he was one of the Greek heroes there on the battlefield. He was sulking in his camp, and it so happened that his friend Patroclus went out to battle, and there he was killed in the thick of battle by Hector, a Trojan. This was something very terrible. The loss touched him so greatly that his scream, it says, of grief and loss brought out his mother Thetis from the depths of the sea to attend to her son Achilles. He decided he was going into battle. Achilles knew it was a battle unto death, but he couldn't care less. His rage was so great, it was thirsting for revenge. What could Mother Thetis do? Well, as a mother, she would have loved to protect her son. A mother's love would naturally want to cover and protect her child. So for Achilles' sake, she goes to the blacksmith god Hephaestus and asks him to forge a full suit of armor and a shield for her son. Now, Homer's Iliad, the great epic, gives a depiction of the scenes of engraving on Achilles' shield. Now, this particular scene was picked up by Auden, and he gives it a contemporary touch. So that's what the Shield of Achilles by W.H.Auden is all about. Let's give a hearing to the Shield of Achilles by W.H.Auden. She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marble well-governed cities and ships upon untamed seas. But there on the shining metal, his hands had put instead an artificial wilderness and a sky like lead. A plain without a feature, bare and brown, no blade of grass, no sign of neighborhood, nothing to eat and nowhere to sit down. Yet, congregated on its blankness, stood an unintelligible multitude, a million eyes, a million boots in line, without expression, waiting for a sign. Out of the air, a voice without a face, proved by statistics that some cause was just, in tones and dry as level as the place. No one was cheered, nothing was discussed. Column by column in a cloud of dust, they marched away, enduring a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else to grief. She looked over his shoulder for ritual pieties, white flower-garlanded heifers, libation and sacrifice. But there on the shining metal, where the altar should have been, she saw by his flickering forge light quite another scene. Barbed wire enclosed in an arbitrary spot, where bored officials lounged, one cracked a joke, and sentries sweated, for the day was hot. A crowd of ordinary, decent folk watched from without and neither moved nor spoke. As three pale figures were led forth and bound, the 3 posts driven upright in the ground. The mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hands of others. They were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. What their foes liked to do was done. Their shame was all the worst could wish. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. She looked over his shoulder for athletes at their games, men and women in a dance, moving their sweet limbs quick to music. But there on the shining shield, his hands had set no dancing floor, but a weed-choked field. A ragged urchin, aimless and alone, loitered about that vacancy. A bird flew up to safety from his well-aimed stone. That girls are raped, that 2 boys knife a third, were axioms to him who'd never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. The thin-lipped armorer, Hephaestus, hobbled away. Thetis of the shining breasts cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son, the strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long. All English literature has its beginnings in Greek and Roman literatures, and the mythology, the art forms, the writing forms are all taken from these major works. Now, when we look at the Shield of Achilles, the description of an object is a poetry form that W.H.Auden was imitating from the classical literature. Apart from that, what W.H.Auden was doing was already done earlier by John Milton, and a little later down the line, John Keats, and of course the neoclassicists. This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives us a few links down the line of poets who did use classical literature. Now, what John Milton did was he brought the classical literature and fused it, or brought a fusion of classical and images and Christian theology. That's what resulted in his magnum opus, that was Paradise Lost. And the beautiful pastoral imagery of classical literature merged with the Christian thought. And the beauty of his work was something that was called the humanist tradition. This was down the line, somewhere in the Romantic age. John Keats wrote Ode on a Grecian Urn. Now here it's completely to do with the aesthetics, or the theory of aesthetics in art. He gave a closing line that said, "Beauty is truth, and truth beauty." Now this famous line brings the aesthetics of classical literature to his writing, something he strongly believed in. W.H.Auden uses classical literature, but with a contemporary touch. As you know, his interest was always the social side of poetry. He wanted poetry to be contemporary. He wanted it to touch the lives of common man, and he would bring social, political thought into poetry. So he uses this episode from the Iliad and gives it a contemporary touch that brings social, political issues into it. That's what W.H.Auden was doing in the Shield of Achilles. When we opened the poem, you can see that it's a beautiful line that says, "She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, for well-governed marble cities and ships upon untamed seas." Look at the beautiful picture of the Mediterranean area that he paints for us. Vines and olive trees, yes, that is what is a part of the Mediterranean look. Our own and the Greeks, who were seafarers, were also adventurers. And they sailed the wild seas, not only for fishing, but they were also explorers. This thirst for knowledge and for new was what drove them onto the untamed seas. But what does he find? He finds something else. He finds a wilderness with a sky as dull as lead. You can see green and you can see the dullness of lead. So you can see the contrasting features of two different settings, barren and fertile. And a voice that emerges out of a million eyes and a million boots that have been lined up. There's just a voice that is asking the soldiers to march on to a cause. that they did not believe in, because the words the poet uses is, they endured a belief. When we say, I believe, it's said with passion, it's said with conviction, it is said with feeling. But when we look at the men, they endured a belief, which means there was a stoic attitude. They just had to take it because they could not help, or they did not have any other option there. So they accepted a belief that would lead them to grief or to sorrow, and they just went marching on. They say that W.H.Auden language was a kind of a telegraphese, a kind of a shorthand kind of an expression. But when I look at the lines that say they endured a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else to grief, those words are so expressive and so strong. They hammer home a point about enduring a belief, about the logic behind it, and a logic that brings them only grief. It's the sound of the words, it's the expression that is so evocative. When expressing an object, we also look at what Keats did in Ode on a Grecian Urn. He was very elaborate. That was Keats' style. He could give a description of all the minute details. But Auden's style is a more or less expressionist, where with a few words and with well-placed expression, he can say a lot. And these are lines that really caught my attention and engaged my interest. So I'd like you to take another look at them. This part of the poem, that stanzas 1, 2, and 3, basically had a look at the setting, which I told you was Mediterranean, and the modern dryness. So you can see the fertility and dryness as one idea that has come up. When you look at the second part, the second stanza that is, you can see a million eyes, a million boots in line. The third stanza is a voice that emerges out of this faceless crowd, faceless in the sense without an expression, without individuality. And the voice has a certain expression. The expression is one that is commanding these common soldiers to march on to their inevitable death. So the setting, the look of the masses, and the voice is what emerges from stanzas 1, 2, and 3 of the Shield of Achilles by W.H.Auden.